Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Manoj Kewalramani, and as the year 2022 is coming to an end, we thought it'd be great to have a special conversation which is forward-looking and which is optimistic without necessarily being unrealistic. So, for that conversation, we have with us Mr. Sundeep Waslekar. Sundeep Waslekar is the president of the Strategic Foresight Group. He's also a senior fellow at the Center for the Resolution of Intractable Conflicts at Oxford University. He's also a signatory to the Normandy Manifesto for World Peace, along with several Nobel laureates and philosophers. And that's largely going to be the theme of our conversation today, which is war and peace. And the anchor for our conversation today is Sandeep's new book, A World Without War: The History, Politics, and Resolution of Conflict. So Sandeep, welcome to this conversation.
My pleasure, Manoj.
So let me begin by asking you, a very standard question as to what was the reason for you to write this book at this point of time. In the book, you begin the book by actually saying that we are at a very unique moment in history, which is incredibly dangerous. So, firstly, describe to us the nature of this dangerous moment and why would you want to write this book at this point of time?
In June 2019, I co-signed Normandy Manifesto for World Peace along with four Nobel laureates in peace and an eminent British philosopher. When we were negotiating the draft of the Normandy Manifesto for almost 6 or 7 months prior to June 2019, I realized from conversations with the Nobel Peace laureates who were the co-signatories that they were quite concerned about existential risk to humanity. And they thought that the way the arms race was escalating and the way it was getting blended with new technologies, there is a very serious risk of a global nuclear war or a global biological war taking place sometime in not too distant future, and that could threaten the survival of our human civilization. And as I started conversing with more and more people and reading about it and following the developments, and then in December 2019, the Russians inducted Avangard hypersonic missile in the Russian Defense Forces. The Americans followed that up with a testing of the American hypersonic missile in March 2020. And this was all happening in the middle of COVID when the leaders of the world were supposed to be rescuing humanity from a pandemic. Instead of that, they were focused on efforts to terminate the human life on the earth with their hypersonic missiles. So I
Yeah.
was very concerned, and then friends suggested that the warnings that we had given in the Normandy Manifesto for World Peace were succinct because the manifesto was just a page, and that I should put in some effort to write a longer essay or a book. And that's how the idea of the book came about. But then, of course, in 2019, there was no time to write the book. And the pandemic ironically provided me a good opportunity to be at the desk and to work on it from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. and every single day for several months and complete this book.
All right. So let me now sort of get to the point that you make in the book, which is you begin the book by talking about that, like you said, right? We are seeing these new weapons being tested, these new systems being tested, and you point out in the first chapter itself that there is not only an increase in the lethality of the weapons that we see today, but there is also an increase in the speed at which weapons are being used and can be deployed, the speed at which a weapon can strike, which reduces the opportunity and the time to take corrective action. And there is increase in the stealth of some of these systems, like including, say, the use of cyber warfare and like hypersonic missiles and things like that, which make it extremely difficult to even predict and to take corrective action. But also there is because of all these things, and because of the use of, say, artificial intelligence increasingly, there's the likelihood of accidents and errors have increased significantly, which can lead to conflict, which can lead to even nuclear conflict at the end of the day as we go up the escalatory ladder. So while you I want you to sort of make this case for us as to, because conventionally the thinking has been that in many ways after the Second World War, increasingly the world has somehow become a much more peaceful place. Yes, we've seen conflict, but the battlefield deaths have declined. Precision weapons have made it much easier to sort of contain what would be collateral damage. And because the stakes are so high with nuclear weapons, we're seeing fewer wars between states, particularly who are nuclear. Just the fact that, the United States and North Korea, for all the friction, we've not. It's been very difficult for the United States to take action because North Korea is a nuclear weapons state. So, firstly, make the argument, make the case that you make about how weapon systems have made the world a much more dangerous place. But then I also, if you could address the question that I've asked in terms of the counter argument that, these weapons have actually, in fact, engendered a certain degree of, peace in some ways, although it's a cold peace.
Well, a lot of people believe that nuclear deterrence has prevented a major war in the last 75 years. What is the theory of deterrence? That a country X doesn't want to attack country Y because the country Y might retaliate in a much, much bigger way on country X. And therefore, country X doesn't want to undertake the first strike. And this is why the first strike or a preemptive strike with nuclear weapons has not occurred and a nuclear war has been averted. And in order to avert a nuclear war, it is generally argued that the wars between superpowers or nuclear weapon states have also been averted. If you see, even in the case of the current Ukraine war, there is a conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and Ukraine is getting wherewithal military hardware from the NATO member states. And as we speak, President Zelensky is in Washington D.C. to ask for more military aid from the United States, and he's obviously expecting to get it. But there is no direct war between United States and the Russian Federation, which are the two weapon sets. So therefore, the argument is that look, everything is fine. Now, first of all, this is a lie that deterrence has prevented a nuclear war. There have been at least 25 cases in the last 75 years when the world came close to the use of nuclear weapons. Some of these happened by accident, some of them were by intent, and some were really well thought out by the heads of states. So there was a situation when Eisenhower thought of using nuclear weapons. No, not Eisenhower, but Eisenhower generals thought of using nuclear weapons, and Eisenhower prevented on them not to use them. There was a time when Nixon thought of using nuclear weapons in Vietnam, which was a non-nuclear state, but Kissinger prevailed upon him not to go that path at the last minute. There is a speculation, but not concrete information, that Margaret Thatcher thought of using nuclear weapons during the Malvinas or the Falkland War. So heads of states have thought of using nuclear weapons, even though they were persuaded by their advisors to do otherwise at the very last minute. There have also been many accidents. In the 1980s, the Russians detected 5 missiles coming from the US, and the officer in charge was going to alert Moscow, and there was going to be a retaliatory attack. But one of the officers in the monitoring team felt that this was some kind of a mirage, that there could not be 5 missiles launched by the US. The number is too few, too small. So they decided not to alert Moscow, and they took a risk. The officer took a risk, and therefore there was no attack by Moscow. Otherwise, there were no attacks launched, no missiles launched by the United States, but there would have been missiles launched by the Soviet Union. So, and there have been at least 20-25 such incidents, and I have described them in my
Yeah.
book. I call them close calls and broken arrows. So
Yeah.
the fact that we have avoided nuclear war because of deterrence is a lie. We have avoided nuclear wars because of courage of individual officers who detected illusions, who detected misperceptions, and took extremely courageous decisions not to respond to them, and also because of courage of several statesmen and senior officials who have prevailed upon their leaders not to use nuclear weapons. But there have been we have had many close calls, too close calls for too many for our comfort. Secondly, as we move ahead, there is a growing use of artificial intelligence. Now, with artificial intelligence, you can detect mobile launchers, which are part of second strike capacity. You can detect unmanned water vehicles, which are part of second strike capacity. So, if there is even a slight suspicion of a risk of a nuclear war, you can disable your enemy from launching a second strike. And because of this, more and more, as artificial intelligence is used, there will be a tendency to use a first strike because your second strike is going to be disabled with artificial intelligence. And the risk, even though it didn't exist in the past, is going to increase a lot. Thirdly, just to say that there have been a fewer number of wars or fewer deaths is to ignore a lot of other realities. The defense expenditure at the global level or the world military expenditure was $1 trillion in 1999, and that was at the end of Cold War. Now, Cold War was an obviously a risky proposition, and we would have thought that after the end of Cold War, the defense expenditure would come down and the West and the East would live in harmony. But this year, the defense expenditure is $2 trillion. Lethality of weapons has increased. You have 2,800 nuclear warheads on hair trigger alert, which means they can be launched within 10 minutes of an executive decision. You have 10,000 nuclear warheads in the military service of 9 countries. And so far, I've only been talking about nuclear weapons. You have the biological weapons being developed in stealth, so we don't really have much information on biological weapons. There are experiments being made to blend a human genome with animal genome to give birth to some third kind of an entity. There are CRISPR-Cas9 technologies being used for gene editing, which can be used for good of humankind, but also for creating new and dangerous biological weapons. And we are in complete darkness about what's happening in the field of bioweapons. Nuclear weapons, at least we have an idea uh, of what's going on. So, in terms of the constant growth in military expenditure in last 20 years, in terms of increase in lethality, and in terms of the use of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, also cyber technologies, the risk to humankind has increased. And I believe there is a possibility that we might engage into a global nuclear war, either by accident or by incident or by intent. All of that is possible. I'm not arguing at all that this could happen this year as a result of Ukraine war. uh, I'm not even suggesting that it could happen in the next 5 years. I'm not able to give a timeline, but I feel that the way the arms race is escalating, we are really looking at the next few decades or this generation or next when a global nuclear war could happen. I'll conclude my comment by quoting Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, who has been repeatedly saying that humanity is one miscalculation away from nuclear annihilation.
No, I understand the sort of concern, and I think you've articulated that really well. The level of sort of, like you said, the lethality of the weapon systems, and we'll get to the what do we do about it. But just to sort of make the case, I completely agree. There's this conversation around sort of weapons of mass destruction, whether it and biological weapons, chemical weapons, is not a new conversation. It's a conversation that's been happening a long time between states. The AI conversation and the lethal autonomous weapon systems conversation is a new conversation. But just the experience of past protocols to be able to build some degree of to be able to address some of these challenges, whether it was the protocols during the Cold War to be able to reduce stockpiles of nuclear weapons, whether it is the dialogue on the biological weapons convention today, or on lethal autonomous weapon systems. What we are seeing is increasingly it becoming much more difficult. So today, when we see the Americans have frequently called upon the Chinese and to sort of join a dialogue with them and the Russians on nuclear weapons, but the Chinese have said, "Look, we're nowhere close to where you are at, so we don't need to enter this conversation right now." On laws, essentially, all parties see that there is the technology is still evolving, and they want to keep the room, particularly the major powers. They want to keep room for themselves to be able to to be able to innovate and to be able to do things without having any sort of restrictions placed on them internationally. And that, I guess, ties to one of the key points that you make in the book, is the role of nationalism and national competition. I want you to talk to us a little bit about that. This idea of nationalism which persists, and national competition within this international environment. Does that give you a sense of that there is an opportunity for a conversation on these fronts, or is it that we are in a world which today is, where the world order is undergoing a churn, where you're going to see jockeying for power, which makes room for any of these compromises much more difficult?
Well, during the Cold War, in a way, there was a safety wall, and the safety wall was an arms control regime. From the 70s until the end of 1990s, you had a lot of arms control treaties which were in operation. And now, as we speak today, the arms control regime has been totally dismantled. Most of the treaties have broken down or they have been renounced. The only functional treaty is the New START treaty, but New START treaty only puts a cap on how many nuclear warheads you can deploy. Nothing more than that, and that's 2,800 is a fairly large number. Now, this whole dismantling of the arms control regime from a very nationalist point of view among the big powers, it's the can be easily attributed to the underlying forces which exist around the world, and particularly in the United States, Russia, and China, the three big powers which are really leading the global security architecture debate. All the countries are going in the direction of hyper nationalism, not just nationalism. When Donald Trump was president of the United States, he declared on the floor of the General Assembly of the UN, he said, I don't believe in globalism at all. I believe in nationalism. I mean, you had the president of the United States announcing on UN General Assembly floor, institution which is supposed to promote global harmony and accord, and he goes and announces it there. If you see the kind of advisors who are advising Putin in Russia, Alexander Dugin, for example, who's his main advisor, he's not advising on strategies and tactics. He is carving out a new ideology, and Putin is trying to put it in practice, which says that nationalism, which is really derived from cultural nationalism, is supreme, and you don't have to care for any kind of universal harmony or universal values. So there is a strong debate in Russia and in China as well, from different perspectives, against any kind of universalism. So you have the three big powers uh, really promoting nationalism, and then you see that in many other countries around the world. You see a certain reinforcement of nationalism in India. You see it in Turkey. You see it in Hungary. You see it in many of the African countries as well. And so, when you are being driven by nationalism, the last time it happened to this extent was in 1930s. Then you want to elect leaders who are nationalist, who have a very limited and narrow perspective. They may be great visionary, but their vision is really derived by protecting national ethos, national history, national interest. And what is this nationalism? People don't even analyze deeply and see what this nationalism they are proud of. I have mentioned in my book an experience on the streets of Kiev, capital of Ukraine, and nowadays, of course, Ukraine is very much in the limelight. That just before the war, when I visited there, on Andritsky Descent, which is a very nice, picturesque street in downtown Ukraine, on Sunday morning, you see these old people in their 80s with wrinkles on their face sitting on the footpath, and they are selling military insignia of the Second World War. So their fathers and their grandfathers fought in the war, and they had the uniforms in the house, and they take out the badges and the symbols of honor, and they sell them for how much? €1, €2. Now, these soldiers, the grandfathers of the old men who are sitting on the footpath of Kiev, once upon a time gave their life in the name of nationalism. And today, their greatest symbols of nationalism and the greatest symbol of national honor is available on the streets of Kiev for €1 or €2. So that's what nationalism is in the long term. but in the short term, we are not ready to analyze what it is. Also, taking the example of Kiev, so at that time, in the 1940s, when the grandparents of the people selling this insignia on the streets, for them, Ukrainian nationalism was blended with Russian nationalism because they were all part of the Soviet nationalism. And today, Ukrainian nationalism is confronting Russian nationalism, and they are in for another war in the contest between those two kinds of nationalism. So you have this competitive nationalism growing everywhere, particularly among the major powers. You have it in the Middle East, not only between Israelis and Palestinians, but also between Saudis and Iranians. You have it in East Asia between the Chinese and Japanese. And you even have a growth of nationalism and national concern and national insecurity in Australia, a country which has been peaceful over the years. So this is growing everywhere, and the leaders of the large countries are looking at the world more and more from a narrow nationalistic prism. The way the leaders of large countries, or the countries that were most powerful in the 1930s, looked at the world.
I want to sort of scratch a little below the surface of this idea of nationalism. So while I agree with you that yes, I actually completely agree with you on the idea of need for deeper thinking on nationalism, and and in the long run, war. And the distinction between patriotism and nationalism that you also highlight in the book, and I think that makes complete sense. But sort of just looking a little bit below the surface, to me, this is not necessarily an era of just nationalism, because it's nationalism sort of interlinked with a certain degree of nativism, uh, and it's a product of how economic, at least sort of the sense of people having lost out from economic globalization. So in the United States, you will see, it's not just make America great again, but make America great again means something about white people within that domestic context. It's not about America as this multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial country. Likewise, in China, if you see, the idea of national rejuvenation is partly linked to territory, but it's also partly linked to Han dominance over minorities. There is and likewise in India, we're seeing a certain degree of nativism along with what we may call as, it's not just Indian nationalism, it's Hindu nationalism to some degree. So we are seeing a certain degree of nativism also sort of coincide with the idea of nationalism, and that's prompting leaders who, because nationalism itself may not necessarily be as problematic. If you, depending on how you define it, you can sort of frame a liberal nationalist worldview, which say one would argue that in India, the generation of freedom fighters, by the time we got independence, although it was a much more complex history, but Indian nationalism as defined in 1947 when the state sort of came to be, and then 50 when the republic came to be, it was in some ways a fairly liberal nationalism. It's changed dramatically for various reasons, and I think a lot of that might have to do with just how states have responded to globalization, and also because, and that to me is also coinciding in an era where we are right now in a place where it is, like you said, regional big power competition and global major power competition, which today is the predominant sort of arc of history, as opposed to, say, globalism, the need for everybody to work together. Which again sort of brings me back to the point that in such an environment, how do you negotiate compromises around issues which may be even fundamentally, challenging, threatening human existence? Climate change is one example. We've not been, it's such a struggle to negotiate something, and you might end up having a group of people who say we don't believe that this is happening at all, and they may be in power in certain countries. So how do you negotiate compromises when you've got these 3 4 different forces which are pulling away from a globalized community?
I fully agree with you. It's not just nationalism, but it's nativism that goes with it. Also, and nationalism dominated by nativism is against any kind of global cooperation. Well, the answer to your question as to how do you negotiate compromises is very difficult. It is necessary to negotiate compromises, but how do we go there is very difficult. But there are some reasons of hope that in the past we have had biological weapons convention, chemical weapons convention, international landmine ban treaty. So we have had some success in negotiating compromises and reaching cooperative agreements. So similarly, in the most difficult environment, you had the in Europe you had the CSC, the in the 1970s, which then got transformed into OSC, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and that all happened in the 70s and 80s. So even at the height of the Cold War and the height of most difficult political environment, compromises have been negotiated. So this past experience gives us hope. But for that to make it real today and tomorrow, looking ahead, we need a number of actors. One, I hope that one of the leaders of a major power sees the light of the day and feels that he wants to reverse, take an initiative to reverse the cycle of violence. Who it could be, I don't know. It may be somebody who is ruling today, but it is more likely to be somebody who is ruling tomorrow, maybe after a few years, maybe after this decade, when the current crop of leaders are replaced by their successors, and we come so close to danger that somebody wakes up and says that, we have to call it a halt, like Tsar Nicholas II of Russia did, and he convened the Hague Conference of 1899 at a time of height of arms race of the 19th century. So, and it was most expected. Russia had no civil society, no parliament, and still the Tsar convened, and he successfully organized the peace conference. It's the Americans and the British who turned down his proposal of cutting down defense expenditure. Mm. But maybe some leader comes up, like Willy Brandt did in Europe. So we have examples of some leaders emerging and taking initiative. In democracies, you can also have hope from peace movements and people's organizations who mobilize public opinion. And to some extent, it is happening counter to the intransigence shown by the state parties who are negotiating lethal autonomous weapons and killer robot agreements and dead against any kind of agreement on the. But there's a whole lot of high-tech community in the United States and in Western Europe which wants agreements to regulate emerging technologies, particularly AI. Now, currently it is limited, but this can expand, because one of the things we really need most urgently is a global agreement on regulating the use of AI and cyber technology and other emerging technologies in order to prevent their misuse in the application of weapons of mass destruction. And there are some little acorns that we can see that are growing. You have political parties in the past who have led an agenda for a change, like the Green Party in Germany made the whole climate change agenda possible in the 80s. So there is no magic wand that can bring about the change, but it will have to come from leaders at all levels. It will have to come from leaders of the states, leaders of civil society, leaders of peace movements. And currently, they are not too many. But one of my purposes of the book is actually to issue a wake up call and hope that somebody hears it and takes an action.
No, and that's really well said, and I sort of agree with you that this is a decade which seems extremely difficult going forward, and we're going to likely see. I mean, it's likely to be dominated by much more contestation between major powers, shrinking of trust, and in that environment, it becomes even more difficult. Particularly, like say, if you're going to negotiate an international agreement on the use of cyber technologies or AI, particularly with regard to weapons of mass destruction. For these agreements to be effective, you need a verification mechanism of some kind, and those, again, the way things are today, it seems highly unlikely. Just if you were to just look at the COVID example, the fact that an international investigation into the origins of COVID has been such a contested, complicated exercise, that when you talk about verification mechanisms on some of these, unless, like you said, we are at the precipice of something really, really dangerous, it seems unlikely that states will be willing to let go of that bit. I wanted to sort of read out one bit from the book as part of my final set of questions, and then ask you a little bit about that. In chapter 5, you talk about the possibility of a federation of states and different experiments also of this nature to try and address some of the challenges that we have. And you say, and I quote, a federation of states cannot provide an adequate remedy to the fault lines experienced by humankind, often resulting in wars, because states are only relevant to some aspects of human affairs. If the relations between people and societies around the world must be recalibrated, we need to develop a dual approach. We need one track involving relations between states and another involving relations between the individual and the world. Now, essentially, here you're talking about not just states dealing with each other, but also civil society playing a big role across the board. And in some ways, you want this civil society to also be not national, but an international civil society. in a world that we're living in today, where this room for civil society seems to have been deeply constrained by domestic politics in most countries, whether it's China, whether it's India, wherever else. Um, and we are now struggling with, and most countries today also have these things called, almost Western countries have been having this conversation about influence operations, and everything has become deeply suspicious around civil society conversation. In India, anytime we see a set of protests, likewise in China, recently we saw protests, you talk about the foreign black hand and things like that. How does it seems really difficult, because it seems like the state has overtaken society. It has stamped its authority over society, and it's constrained the space within which society can act. So in India today, we see, right, when people tend to protest, either they get blocked as anti-nationals and or put in prison for elongated periods of time. So how does civil society evolve in an environment where it seems like governance around the world is veering towards more authoritarianism, to be able to arrive at even this goal that you're talking about?
A civil society is an agency. Basically, it's ordinary people, the citizens of the world. Their consciousness uh, has to grow, and they have to be aware of their dual loyalty. One is their loyalty to their nation, and the other is their loyalty to humankind. And it's only when billions of common people realize that they are part of Vasudeva Kutumbakam, as a living reality, not as a slogan, that we will start seeing some transformation. And this Vasudeva Kutumbakam is an Indian philosophy, but you have counterparts of these philosophies in Japan, in Africa. Africa, there is Ubuntu. I exist because you exist, or I am because we all are. So it's only when people start realizing the significance of their integration with the world, and they start developing a dual loyalty, that we'll start seeing the change. Um, and for that awareness has to grow, self realization has to grow, and civil society, while it may not be able to mobilize the states to perform or behave in a way that they desire, they may play a certain role in raising awareness of citizens, and that is something that the states might find difficult to crush, as we are seeing in Iran, in the context of freedom of expression there, and as we saw in fact Soviet Union in the 1980s, when a poet launched a movement to ban testing, and until today, since 1998 until now, except for North Korea, none of the nuclear weapon states have tested a weapon. Now they'll be able to do it with the help of artificial intelligence in a simulated form. But so far, last 25 years, except North Korea, we have been free of testing, and this was all achieved by a movement led by a poet, just ordinary people, not even an organized or a structured civil society. So is that consciousness that has to grow, and civil society will have to function at various levels, not only in terms of providing alternative policies and mobilizing for alternative policies, but also for raising the awareness of the world. Finally, Rousseau wrote Social Contract in 1762. This was the time of Encha regime. There was no democracy and there were no republican states. But social contract is essentially about a relationship between society and state, or an individual and the government. And he conceived it at a time when the monarch ruled everything in partnership with the church. So it may look impossible today, as it looked during the Encha regime time, to imagine a global social contract because of these competitive forces of nationalism and Fissiparous tendencies. But we have to create a soft infrastructure of ideas, and we have to make these ideas popular, and we have to engage leaders as well as citizens. I would not exclude leaders at all, because there are leaders who think in different ways, into a vision of a new world, and then we wait for a right political opportunity, or a window when this soft infrastructure of ideas can be put in place to begin the transformation of the world. Now, this opportunity can come in a violent way with a limited nuclear war, and in one part of the world, and then everybody will wake up, and hopefully humanity will still survive. Or it can come in a non-violent way. It can come in a way that is uh, based on better realization of universal values. So we have to wait and see. But if we wait for that opportunity to be opened up in a violent way, we might just get it wrong. And
Yeah.
if it is indeed a global nuclear war or a biological war or war involving any of the weapons of mass destruction, it may not be an opportunity at all. It might be just a call for the final termination of human civilization.
I think that's an excellent point, and I think I will end with this idea that we need to build this soft infrastructure of ideas, which talk about a better future, which talk about a much more sustainable, much more a future without war, or a world without war, as you've argued in the book. And I want to thank you for this conversation. We've only, like I said, just scratched the surface of the book. There is tremendous material in there. There is tremendous research, and and it's an extremely easy read, which is extremely difficult to do for an extremely challenging subject like international geopolitics and war and the complications of war, and where it mixes with technology and civil society movements and all of that. So I commend you again for the book. I think it's a fantastic read, and I would recommend all our listeners to pick up their copy and read. I want to, however, sort of have one final question to which I would request a brief answer. And you do address this in the book, but I want to sort of, I would like our listeners to read, because I presume a number of them, when they read the title A World Without War, would say that this is utopia. War and conflict is, inherent to human nature. The international system is one of anarchy. So how would you address that argument that war is inherent to human nature and it can't be eliminated?
A world without war may sound to be a utopian dream, but it is actually a pragmatic necessity if we want to survive as a human civilization and as species.
Perfect. I think we'll end with that. Thank you so much, Sandeep.
Thank you, Manoj. It's been a pleasure to be with you. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.